Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Head into your local Safeway for great spring savings throughout the store. This week at Safeway, get yellow peaches or nectarines for the member price of $1.88 per pound. Also this week at Safeway, value packs of Signature Farms chicken drumsticks, thighs, leg quarters, or picnic packs are buy one, get one free. Plus, get value packs of USDA choice boneless beef top sirloin steak for the member price of $4.99 per pound. Visit Safeway.com, download the Safeway for You app, or head in store to find more great deals at Safeway.
Ozcast.
Welcome to Strategikon. Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Audience, thanks for your patience. It's been quite a while since our last podcast in December of last year. We apologize for this unusual break in transmission. There were some strange things happening at the beginning of 2023 around my work schedule and that of producer Michael's. I was drawn into planning for a major defense exhibition and conference scheduled for 2024 here in Adelaide, and Michael was drawn away from us to sunny Queensland for a bit of Army Reserve training. But the gang is back, and we are ready to rumble like the proverbial Leopard 2 main battle tank. Today from the UK, at the unholy hour of 2 a.m, we are joined once again by Rhoderick Miller. Over 1 year into the Russia-Ukraine war, we check in to see what Rod's hyper-realist perspective says about this awful human calamity. Now, Rhoderick, we need to talk about a couple of things. Let's initially start off with the Russia-Ukraine war. Belarus is offering to station Russian nuclear weapons on its soil. Should we be concerned by this development, or is this just another one of Putin's many nuclear weapons scare campaigns?
How do I put this? Belarus is independent in name only and has been pretty much from the minute we tried to overthrow the Belarusian government in a color revolution not so long ago. Putin went in, he saved them, he's their boss, it's part of Russia in all but name. It's a nice legal nicety for them. Belarus doesn't have to necessarily face any of the sanctions that Russia gets from the West. It's a good way of, in the future, negotiating away once the crazies are out of office in Europe. Mm-hmm. But Belarus is Russia.
Yeah.
And
David,
so it doesn't matter if they're
sorry about that. Well, what do you think? It's a time lag thing. That's all right. I having seen many YouTube videos, I understand that this is a common occurrence between, hosts and co-hosts and guests. You always have that little second time lag where you think the other person's finished and then you talk on top of them. It's a terrible thing. David, what do you think about this notion of Russian weapons being stationed in Belarus?
I think two things about it are worth talking about. One, it's a pretty logical thing to do, and I completely agree with Rhoderick that Belarus is part of Russia. Even though most of the population might rather not be, the reality is everyone who controls the state is essentially their survival depends on Russia. I think there's two significant things about this. One, what's the real advantage in the short term? And the advantage in the short term is it will provide a high level of cover when Russia eventually do a thunder run towards Kyiv with 300,000 recently trained troops and a whole lot of refurbished armor that quite possibly will end the war. The second side of this is look at when it was announced. It was announced straight after Putin and Xi met, and it all looked like everything was lovely. And then Xi went home and immediately invited everyone from the Astans to come to China and have a big chat about the middle corridor and didn't invite Putin. So it's simultaneously something that Russia absolutely needs to do, and an indication that I think the CCP thinks Ukraine/Russia is a shit show.
I'm not sold on yours, but I do think there's another one you need to keep in mind is we are not paying attention to how emotionally harmful the idea of depleted uranium is being sent to Ukraine to the Russians, because they purged their entire system of depleted uranium. They don't want anything of it anywhere near Russia. And the minute Britain said the challengers will have depleted uranium rounds, of like, no, we're putting our foot down. So, I mean, I'm not dismissing David's component, but we're missing how pissed off they were about that.
They're pissed off about it because it's a tank killer, not because they're pissed off about DU as DU.
Hang on, guys. The Russians have DU themselves, and again, they've been unverified reports that Russians have been using DU in the field on their T-80s. Now, they can't put the DU into the T-54 or T-64, but the fact of the matter is that the Russians themselves have stockpiles of DU. Should this have been such a big deal for the Russians, considering the fact that they do have their own stocks? So really, in the end, NATO supplies depleted uranium shells for their, Challenger tanks at the very least. But the Russians, if they really wanted to unleash hell on Ukraine, could have, and probably has, already used depleted uranium themselves.
I assume it will be part of the Thunder Run to Kyiv when that invasion starts, because that invasion is going to be for keeps. And it's going to be there that we're going to see the Challengers and the Abrams and the Leopards used as striker brigades to try and stop the loss of Kyiv. So that is going to be a new level of awful compared to anything we've seen yet.
My view is they have no problem with depleted uranium in Germany, in Spain, maybe marching through Austria or so on. But Ukraine is now Russia, and there's no DU going to be used on Russia. That's the component. You don't get to use it on Russia, and Ukraine is going to be Russia.
Again, this would just be part of the shit show that's coming ahead.
As to their stockpiles, they have huge stockpiles. They did, just like us, they went down that. But then they had an allergic reaction to it. It's kind of like them and bioweapons. They came a line, they got right up to the line, and then it went, this is a mistake. Draw back.
It's not a mistake. It's the realization that in such a corrupt system full of people who will sell or steal anything, and where the factions will do almost anything, there's no cohesive way to control it.
That's a reasonable assertion, yeah. But at any rate, whether you're right about China or not, I don't know. I need to mull over that one. But everything I saw was this depleted uranium is a step too far.
So but, is Putin's... Go on, Rhoderick.
I don't think ultimately they matter because Belarus is Russia.
Is Putin's status as Xi's junior ally now complete? Following on from the big meeting, the big powwow between Xi and Putin.
I don't think junior. I think they are now partners. But here's the reality. On the battlefield, Russia wins. In the economy, China wins. The two have no incentive to fight each other. And we gave them that.
Yeah, the only friend they've got is each other, even if it's a shit show. And it is, because they don't like each other. They don't agree with anything other than they've got no one else they can work with.
Well, they got North Korea.
Yeah, but sorry, them you just want to keep in a box and periodically pour in enough oil and rice that it doesn't explode.
Yeah, well.
They're very successfully getting India. And that's Lavrov, and that's Putin. India's coming on board.
Modi's India's coming on board. Well, that's going to have some interesting repercussions for the Quad.
Yes.
What's the Quad ever done?
Nothing.
Well, that's also true.
Right. So where's the issue?
Well, there's no real issue. But, politics is all about perception. And, we've had a couple of governments here in Australia now giving the perception that the Quad is actually something. What it is, I don't know. No one's really successfully explained it. It's not an alliance. It's an alignment of sorts, but it's based on three very tightly bound US allies to one strategically autonomous player, which is India. And that strategic autonomy, the Indians are not willing to sacrifice for anybody, including for the mighty Joe Biden. So, yeah, I mean...
Quad only works with Trump. You don't have Trump, you don't have the Quad. And there is nobody on the Republican side and there's nobody on the Democrat side who can get India back emotionally, because they love Trump.
Oh, they did. Well, that is true. That is true. Actually, and that really comes down to the strength of leader versus leader relations in terms of how this all plays out. You know, I mean, Xi and Putin seem to get on reasonably well, you know, for whatever their ultimate aim happens to be. Trump got on reasonably well with pretty much every autocrat he could get his grubby little hand onto. But, you know, Biden, of course, is trying to rectify that and reverse course. Has Biden's strategy...
Hold on. Sorry, John, I have to interrupt that. You want the other side to be friendly with you. Trump did the right thing.
Did he?
Biden is a fanatic. He scared the bejesus out of everybody. And Trump wined and dined them.
But if you were going to say, if you say that, then aren't you opening the door to the accusation of apologizing for appeasement? You know, because I mean, Trump was an appeaser. He didn't want to have war with Russia, but he also wanted to sit down and have his photo opportunity and a cup of tea with Vladimir Putin. You know, Russia during the Trump period was probably not considered a friend nor an enemy. It was, to use the millennial vernacular, a frenemy, right, of the United States. But certainly it wasn't a country that the Americans could trust with any degree of certainty. And I think that they were quite right not to trust them.
Kissinger in the 60s trying to do triangulation. I mean, the point of the matter is this. A, it's normal diplomacy. B, appeasement is only a bad word because Hitler was a sociopath. And he had the ability behind Germany to, in fact, there's no evidence that Xi is a sociopath. There's no evidence that Putin is a sociopath. We portray Putin as a Hitler. In reality, Putin is a liberal Democrat and a moderate. It's only because he's president of Russia that he has to be a hardliner. And compared to all the people around him, he's the most moderate person in the room.
Oh, well, I mean, if you went to say Warsaw and you know, said that, or you went to any Eastern European country barring Hungary, you know, you would probably get a lot of pushback on that. You know, I mean, there were Eastern European countries that had been occupied by the Soviet Union and who had felt the lash of Soviet rule for quite some time. So you would say that those East European countries were quite right not to think that the bear was some sort of cuddly soft power that they could, you know, cozy up against and allow them to be caught in a trap between competing for Moscow's attention or Brussels' attention or the Western capital's attention if you don't believe in the EU project. That was never the case. Russia always portrayed itself as an aggressive, belligerent state, whether it was Tsarist, whether it was Commissarist, or whether it is Putinist. There is a historical continuum in the way that Russia presents itself to the world, but particularly in its so-called spheres of influence. Now, if you happen to be under the jackboot of Russia or have had that experience, surely the idea of being in the Western liberal orbit would be far more attractive and alluring than the prospect of being joined to Russia, where Russia has really not much to offer other than you can be conscripted into the army and we will tell you, you can see the world, you can go to Africa and do the good fight, you know? I mean, what is the soft power that Russia ever had to attract the East Europeans, including the Ukrainians, to their orbit?
So let's do a really important thing that we all miss in the Western world. Tsarist Russia and revolutionary Russia and Stalinist Russia, the Estonians, the Latvians, all those Baltic countries, the Chihuahua states, their ruling classes were disproportionately empowered in those systems. And not only that, they disproportionately populated the dodgy parts of it, the NKVD, KGB, the death squads. They kind of lost a lot of power at the end of the Soviet period, and they really lost out once they were kicked out of the Soviet Union. So these are people who had massively disproportionate power. They've also got the money of being part of the West, and they've got nothing else to sell. The only thing they have to sell is Russia's a baddie. So they sell it. And, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said they were right. There's a shark, and they jumped it. And they jumped it about 10 years ago because Putin is not Hitler, because Russia is not Germany in 1938. We've oversold the message. And, these people are deeply embedded. America's, what's the term they use? Penetrated hegemony. It's so deeply penetrated by Eastern Europeans that those ideas and the narrative and the marketing of how bad Russia is deeply infused into the American political elite, and also Britain's. I mean, it's deep here. The Russophobia is very, very powerfully embedded here, and it comes largely from Eastern European immigrant populations who were disenfranchised by the end of the Soviet Union.
All right. If you were saying that, then, I would have to ask you, what were the positives that Russia gave Eastern Europe to not align with NATO and or the European Union or the West generally? What were after this fall of the Soviet Union, what would have been the key ingredients that East Europeans would have checked off their list saying, okay, the Soviet Union is over, the Russian jackboots off our throats, and, we can afford to just hang out as independent, neutral countries in Europe, so Russia doesn't feel freaked out and NATO doesn't get freaked out, and we're a belt of countries just happily sitting in the middle. What would have been the key takeaway from, say, for instance, the East European perspective that they could have gotten away with that sort of policy? Because I don't see it, Rhoderick. I don't see it.
I don't know.
Great power
I don't know
politics.
how you could.
Hey?
So think of it this way: their narrative is a drug. Their narrative that Russia is bad is a drug.
Yeah, but beyond the narrative, what does Russia offer Eastern Europeans in terms of an alternative to being a belligerent state and a potential occupier?
Well, it offers cheap commodities, cheap resources, cheap energy. Apart from that, nothing.
Security?
That is the problem.
Does it offer security? I mean, do East Europeans even have a right to actually think that they could live securely in a non-aligned Eastern European fictional entity with a militarized Russia on the side? Hey?
Sweden, Finland, they had it for ages. The deal was, we have a nice peaceful bit in between. NATO doesn't rub up against Russia. Russia doesn't rub up against Europe. And the guys in the middle get rich on the transactions. That was supposed to be the deal. And then Clinton stabbed them in the back. Clinton and Bush ended the post-Cold War arrangement, which was neutrality in between.
All right, David?
I think we're trying to go into an ideological angle here that is unnecessarily complicated, and we don't have enough data to reach meaningful conclusions. The simple thing is, the Soviet Union could not sustain itself economically, collapsed under its own weight, and the gravy stopped flowing. And for anyone that got out fast and early, that could look west easily, it appeared there was lots of gravy in the West. And you come up with whatever story you need to bullshit to get access to gravy. So Sweden and Finland could live in the middle because by being in the middle, there was enough money to be made. So there, Rhoderick's right. It was simply about the capacity to do okay in a difficult situation. But when the Soviet Union collapsed because it could not function economically, there was a delusion that the neoliberal system could continue to just throw money into things and that would last forever. And this is really why the last 10 years has got so confusing, because there isn't enough money left. And the West is not willing to throw it around to sustain the former Soviet states in the way they became accustomed to in the 90s and early 2000s. The cash flow from both sides has ended.
Yeah. And the only way they get the money is by Russia being bad and Russia being scary, Russia being Germany 1939.
Well, again, the Germany 1939 bit, that's us looking at it from the West. Really, the Eastern Europeans are smart enough to go, those people who are east will change their mind in a heartbeat and change history in a heartbeat. at least in the West, once cash flows, the system's sclerotic and will flow for a while. So it's the thing between people who can be really difficult in a millisecond and people who can only be really difficult in a year. And I know what I'd rather pick.
Yeah.
There is another interesting angle to all of this, and that is the position of Sweden and Finland now, because they're so keen to scramble over the line to, join NATO. I mean, if they profited so well under the old system, being neutral countries, making money from both sides, why could they not do that now? What's changed that made them flip sides, basically, abandon neutrality and move west? What is the big issue?
Well, fundamentally, Finland's been doing it for nearly 20 years. They are the closest thing to a NATO military that isn't NATO in the world. And they did that of their own accord. They've been hedging towards this since the early 2000s. Their level of interoperability is better than Australia's with NATO forces. So there's nothing fast about that. And Sweden made a gratuitous amount of money out of selling weapons and IKEA furniture to the entire world during the Cold War. And there's another opportunity here to be on the right side of the arms business.
Yeah, okay.
It is money. I mean, it's money, and it's also infiltration by ideologues. But that's all of us. Everybody, apart from maybe Hungary and Turkey, all have that.
Yeah, but that's because Turkey's got its own ideology, and because Hungary is sort of so lost in what it's meant to be and where it's meant to fit, it wants its own ideology at the cost of its own future. So Turkey has one, Hungary wants one.
Yeah. I mean, Hungary's future depends on how far the Russians go. If the Russians go to Lviv, Hungary has a future. If they don't, they're going to be strangled on the vine.
Well, again, let's put economic context into this. Early 1990s, the Germans roll every factory they possibly can east. Poland's factories are coming to their end now. The Czechs' factories got upgraded, and the Czechs actually make nice stuff and can develop technology on their own for manufacturing. The Slovakians, the Slovenians, again, the factories are running out. The interesting country in all this that never got any factories was Hungary. By the time Hungary unscrambled its egg to the point of being able to hold its hand out and go, please, can we have an economy? The Germans had pretty much moved in everything they wanted to move, and Hungary missed the boat. As a consequence of missing that boat, the only direction it can look is towards Russia, even though historically that would have freaked it out, which is why they can have such a strange political elite now, because they know that nothing in history says this is a good idea. But also, historically, they should have had a deal from the West, and they didn't. So they are so lost and confused. It's the only game available to them. They will put whatever spin on it they need to make it look like it's pro-Hungary, when all it is please don't let us die.
Yeah, that's the thing. If the border's there, they will flourish. And if it's not there, they will die on the vine.
Yeah, because again, they've been dying literally since they got out from under communism. There has been no surge of awesomeness. There was no period of young people going, woohoo, look, education, opportunity, and more money. That's all been skipped in Hungary.
Although there is one interesting development in Hungary, which tends not to get the media headlines. And I was listening to a podcast, one of those Jordan B. Peterson podcasts, and they were talking about population and the importance of a young population to a country's future. Of all the European states that have tried and failed to tackle the population problem, Hungary seems to be teetering on the verge of modest success in raising their own population of younger Hungarians?
Yeah, largely because unlike the Poles and the Czechs and the Bulgarians and the Romanians, they couldn't easily move to Europe. The Hungarian government made it too hard. So fundamentally, they didn't breed any more humans.
Yeah.
They just couldn't leave.
So, having been out on the outer for a while, if, for instance, things were to radically change against Russia and the Orban government dies in the wall and then a pro-Western government, comes into being in Budapest, I mean, is that going to be something that will allow the Germans to rethink its position with regard to the Hungarians, considering that they have got well, basically an untouched economy they can go into and exploit.
I'll spin it even differently to that, and that is screw the Germans, they're too slow. The people who are fast are BlackRock. If BlackRock are going to make money out of the war and potentially rebuild Ukraine if it manages to win, how hard is it to do the same thing with one more bordered country?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about how much money the 1% can make, nothing else.
Yeah.
But the likelihood of that win is so tiny.
Yeah, but again, it comes back to BlackRock. Do BlackRock care? They own 20% of defense shares in major US defense companies. The longer this war goes on, the more money they make. And if the Ukrainians who don't want to be part of Russia all flee rest, BlackRock will still have, the contracts to build and do everything along the Polish border to make the new front line. So either way, it's nothing to do with war anymore and simply down to how rich can the rich get.
If the Russians do win, Hungary is the entry point into Europe for the Chinese Belt and Road.
Yeah.
And then they make all the money.
Yep. And again, this is why I think Turkey is so desperately working on the middle corridor now, knowing that if they don't get the middle corridor up and running now, it will never happen.
So,
and I think the Chinese will win in the end. They're offering more money, ultimately. At the end of the day, they're offering more money in the long run. Just the Americans through BlackRock are offering more money now.
Yeah, but more money now is becoming very significant to most people who are hungry. Now, it's that old thing, you promise me gold tomorrow or food today. Food today wins.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if I'm not alive tomorrow. And the other side of this too is, again, something that's very hard getting good numbers on, but we're seeing delays worldwide still on deliveries of products from China. Shipping still appears to be no higher than 60% pre-COVID levels. Manufacturing must therefore be low because you wouldn't be making it and stacking it in ports and containers for a year. There's no point. So as much as the Chinese are throwing money around, the question has to start being asked, okay, Turkey's upping its ability to make things dramatically. Americans are moving companies back to Mexico as fast as they can do it. India is getting more manufacturing than it's ever had. Vietnam is going through the roof. Indonesia is going through the roof. Even Thailand, under the generals, is getting more manufacturing. And even Malaysia, that really doesn't do manufacturing very well, other than bits and pieces of the mid-level chip market, is getting more manufacturing. So the point here is when Dr. Doom comes out and said, you can no longer call China the factory of the world, that what we've actually got to the point now is 4 or 5 growing sources of production where shipping might be more reliable, where timeframes might be better. You'll pay more for it, but you'll get it sooner. China will always be a mega regional power, but if it can't deliver cheap stuff on time at the moment, it's providing an opportunity for further destabilization of trade. And that does really seem to be happening.
Yes. There's other things you've got to keep in mind, though. And that big thing is we in Western Europe can't buy it. Sooner or later, once the price of our fuel really, really kicks in, winter of next year, spring of the year after, it doesn't matter how much the Chinese can make, we can't buy it.
Yeah, and by then,
and
because Turkey is so close, anything made in Turkey becomes your best bet because the cost is so much cheaper because of fuel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay. I think ultimately what we will get is all of these, what was that term? World island. All of those world island economies will integrate much more thoroughly. I think, if you look at the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, what was 100-year period of like Britain being the technological power and it's starting with fabric, and then America and Germany kicking in, and then now China, then Russia, and then China. That 100-year period became a 50-year period in the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's become a 30-year period now. And I think we're some way into that 30-year period. I think we're probably about 10 years into it. So after India, we are going to have Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. You're already going to get it starting in Nigeria. But they can't all compete with one another if they're all making the same stuff. So they're going to have to specialize.
Well, either that or we get the Bremer argument of pivot states and clients and basically a divided world that resembles more of 17th century empires who don't interact. Because again, who's going to pay for security? And if what you need to secure more than anything is water and food, then manufactured goods may also be inside your bubble, because if we're going to have so many bubbles staring at each other, every bubble has to have competence, because you don't know who you can trust to trade with. So it seemed the Americans have sorted their bubble. There realistically is a Japan, Australia bubble if we look after Southeast Asia. Africa's going to get more ability to make things than it's had for a long time. Latin America is the interesting one because there's so much social mayhem at the moment. It looks like it's stalling economic development again. So the number of things going on at the moment, like looking at Ukraine and China is, well, most days I just don't bother anymore because most of the information we get is garbage. Whereas what we're seeing is the flow-on effect of China as the only workshop. Now that is ending, and what comes after is, just like Rhoderick says, eventually there's too many people competing unless they're protected bubbles. So either we get protected bubbles or we have to move back to some form of globalization where people do one thing well. And I think the one thing we can say about most of the world at the moment is no one wants that again, because it allowed China to become what it is, and it kept a lot of other people poor for a very long time. So I can't see anyone signing up for a version of globalization if fundamentally wars are now being run by BlackRock rather than the American government. They don't give a shit about globalization. They just want to make money where they can and have good deals, and would rather lock stuff down. France seems smart enough to look out towards the world, and see we got to do our own thing because Europe's going to be totally dysfunctional. So I just don't see where this global. Sorry, you go, Rhoderick.
It seems to me we have now the race between Britain and France to see who gets to dominate Western Europe. And that's very, very much back to 16th century politics.
Yep, and I'm voting on France for just being a bit smarter at everything.
They're smarter, but we're lucky.
They're smarter and you're meaner.
If we go
That's
back,
true.
If we go back to a more tactical issue here, gentlemen. Pro-war blogger Vladimir Tatarsky was killed in a blast in a St. Petersburg cafe. We've heard a lot of stuff go on within Russia with regard to elements of anti-Putinist or pro-Ukrainian people, groups, whatever you want to call them, going about doing the dirty within the sanctity of the Russian state. How significant do you think the assassination of this pro-war blogger is for the Russian state? Does it show that the Russian state is not on top of security internally as it should be?
It kind of kills the myth of lots of Russian myths are getting killed at the moment, and one of them is the all-knowing, all-seeing Russian state, which is a myth we built for ourselves, and the Russians don't really live under that. There are plenty more bloggers. My suspicion is the line between pro-war and pro-Russian is being a bit blurred here, because if you're pro-Russian at the moment, you are pro-war, not necessarily the same thing.
And the fact that he was making the point, I'm pro-war, but we're doing a shit job of it. So he was trying to use the pro-war thing to cover. So I actually think he was probably killed by the system, not by anyone outside the system.
The number of what we insist on calling oligarchs who've gone flying out of their buildings in the last 6 months. And everyone's going, it's Putin, it's Putin, it's Putin. My suspicion is Putin's doing about half of that, and we're doing about half of that. And I don't know which ones are which, because we don't know the details. My suspicion is this was Ukrainians rather than Russians. And we will never really know. In the long run, Russia will become a meaner, harder place, much more down on its subversives than it's been pretty much since the revolution.
I'll go back to my comment of 8 months ago. Now they're going to become the big hermit kingdom.
Yeah, except certainly as long as they've got Lavrov and Putin.
But they won't for much longer because of their age.
Yes, age is a thing. I mean, we don't know what happens with who's next. They're all hardliners. The last two moderates are Putin and Lavrov.
Yeah, even if we take Medvedev, he's now gone and put the headband on real tight and decided where his true future lies. So even if we view Medvedev as the least freaky of the freaks, we've got a big hermit kingdom. And that'll suit Xi perfectly because she wants a big hermit kingdom. They're different big hermit kingdoms.
Except there's a lot of people who are going to be in on the big hermit kingdom, like all of Africa and most of South America.
Yeah, but the great thing with the hermit kingdom is you can trade with everybody. You can set up university cities to educate everybody, but you still treat your population like you do, as we say, or else. Again, the Russian, version of the Chinese social credit system for whether you do military service. What a great export of technology and ideas.
What about Blinken and his demands to Russia to release US journalist Evan Gershkovich, I think his name is? Again, it's one of those tactical issues between the United States and Russia. Do you think that there's going to be an escalation of this kind of thing where US journalists or anyone of American origin that happens to be on the wrong side of the border will be treated rather grubbily? I mean, there was that Griner affair as well, where you had that
the basketballer
that was caught up in all sorts of things. What do you think advantages the Russian state by doing this sort of thing? I mean, really, what were the charges that they put on to Gershkovich? He was delving into national security issues. Well, I mean, he's a journalist.
It doesn't really matter what the accusation was. The reality was it was time in the Russian news cycle for Bad West at a human level rather than a political level. So it's just part of the cycle.
I mean, there is also another factor, is that it's a you nab one, we nab one. The Americans got one last 2-3 weeks ago, and you swap them and you change them. That's a very old-fashioned Cold War thing. And who nabbed the first one? I'd guess it's probably us, because we kicked everything off this time. It's tit for tat.
It's just part of the media cycle. That's all it is.
Yeah. And as with the basketball woman, I mean, the Americans so screwed that up internationally because there was an ex-soldier. Now, there's lots to be said about who and what this ex-soldier was, but you had a choice between an ex-soldier with loads of medals, probably spying for the United States, and you had a choice between a basketball player who was clearly guilty of a legitimate Russian crime. And we chose the basketball player. Well, the Biden administration.
Yeah, but of course they did. Because otherwise her wife would have looked sad on TV. Again, none of this is anything but the comms cycle.
Yes, and then you play that message in Africa, in the Middle East, in all the stands of the world, and they all go, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy? You left your soldier behind in exchange for this woman."
Yeah, but the interesting thing is when they did get the soldier out, they traded him for a low-level drug dealer.
Yeah.
So again, the tit-for-tat thing, the Russians understand the optics. The Americans only understand the optics. The Russians understand the optics for the entire world. The Americans only think in terms of the optics for their own voting public. So it's the great advantage of not taking democracy seriously is you can get on with running optics seriously at a global level.
And the Russians got the Lord of War. You can't sell that message any louder.
Yeah, come on, getting Victor back has to be a cool day. Now we've got to rewatch the Nicolas Cage movie.
Yeah.
So, Rhoderick, I have a question for you, and that is, why hasn't Bakhmut fallen yet?
Oh, it's a double envelopment. How do I put this? You got to. The last time I was on, I was going to start talking about the numbers, and David shot me down with an emotional narrative, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't deal with emotions very well. You got to look at the numbers. So from the top, all of Europe makes 5,000 shells a month. We don't know how many the Americans make. We don't know how many the Russians make, but we can kind of guesstimate. The Ukrainians are firing 20,000 a week. The Russians are firing 20,000 a day, sometimes up to 40,000 a day. The Wagner Group is firing 20,000 a day into Bakhmut. The Wagner Group is firing more than the entire Ukrainian army. Ukrainians cannot let Bakhmut go. There is a strategic reason for it, in that it's a linchpin. There's a massive emotional component in that if it falls, they're really scared they're going to end up against the back of a wall. So Wagner and the Russian army proper have Bakhmut encircled. They've been slowly squeezing, building up the emotional draw, and in come the Ukrainians, and then they die. So that's why we get the figures, guesstimated figures, reasonably guesstimated, that the Ukrainians have lost 80,000 men defending Bakhmut. And that's all sorts of losses. There was one American volunteer mercenary who guesstimated that Ukrainians had a life expectancy of 4 hours in Bakhmut. Why schlep to the other side of Ukraine to kill Ukrainians when you can just sit there, shoot at them, go back and have coffee? It's a great killing space. And now it's double enveloped. So there's one road in, there's one road out. You can't drive along it, you got to walk it. You can't take out your heavy armor. The Ukrainians have blown up their own bridge. It's killing space. And the Russians are happy to stay there and kill.
So what do you make of the reports, though, that, you know, the Russians themselves have put so much effort and energy in the entire special military operation that Russian defense industry is having a hard time keeping up with its own production and supply issues? Therefore, they are now dipping into the well that is Cold War material. I mean, they've been doing that with shells, for instance, and even some missiles, Cold War missiles. But they're certainly doing it with armor. You know, the idea of being able to retrofit a T-64 for modern 21st century tank warfare sounds like a bit of a stretch to me. And considering the fact that they're placed under so many sanctions, and a lot of their modern equipment, like, say, for instance, what you find in an Armata T-14 tank, or you know, many of the modern Su-35 fighters and their derivatives, they do have Western components. Some of those components come from France, some of them come from nefarious sources, but have been sort of shuttled around. But you know, those avenues have now been pretty much closed to the Russians. So how do you think they can continue pushing their military barrow as hard as they have? Because, you know, the Chinese aren't providing the Russians with lethal aid, at least not in the quantities that you would think would be war winning. Where are they getting their technology and industrial support for sustaining their war effort from?
Okay, so there's an easy answer and there's a complicated answer. Okay, why are they struggling? Well, I think we're massively overstating why they're struggling, but they're struggling because they're in the process of adding 1 million extra soldiers. You cannot arm and equip 1 million extra soldiers with brand new equipment. Nobody can do it. Nobody's ever been able to do it. The Americans kind of did it in the Second World War, but after they turned their entire economy into a war economy. The tanks are largely being used as assault guns and motorized artillery, is my understanding. But like, Russia makes and refurbishes at the moment 1,000 tanks a year. Britain struggles to get into the double figures. And they're going to go from make and refurbish to make 1,000 brand new tanks a year. They've got 1 million shells for the older models in storage. And they're building a new tank army of 1,000 tanks. Of course, you're going to have to go into your old stock, especially if these guys are never going to face an actual tank. Because keep in mind, we make a big fuss about all the Western stuff that's going. Britain's sending 12 tanks. I think Canada's sending 8 against a standing tank army of already 3,000 modern Russian tanks, plus the extra 1,000 they're bringing off the line out of storage. It's numbers. As to the equipment stuff, the thing with China is it's not for Russia, it's for China. Chinese have never tested their stuff. They don't know if it works.
Yep.
And he has a place to play.
Why aren't we seeing J-20 fighters being flown by Russian pilots?
Well,
that would be a great way of testing the equipment. That's what the Russians did often during the Cold War, to find out whether or not their stuff worked, right?
Yeah. Well, I think A, it's probably a matter of time, and B, the Russians have no shortage of planes. And it's not a plane-friendly combat zone. Because although the Ukrainian defenses are largely wiped out, there's still arguably the second best air defenses in the world after the Russians. There's not a lot of planes.
Can I just say something here about this? A lot has been said in the media about, the redundancy of armored warfare, especially in the early start of the war, where we started seeing tanks go up because of, javelins and various other Western shoulder-launched missiles to soldiers in Ukraine. There was story after story saying the tank is now a redundant piece of equipment, and yet the only thing that I think is redundant on the Ukrainian battle space is the combat aircraft, because of the unfriendly air envelope that they have to pass through to drop their ordnance. The only pieces of aerial equipment that people feel comfortable playing around with at the moment are drones.
But those aeroplanes are only really redundant in 3 or 4 airspaces, which are Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and China. Those aircraft are not redundant in Western Europe because we don't have air defense systems like the Ukrainians. We rely on aircraft.
Yeah, we do. That's true.
We over-rely on aircraft. And, if BlackRock really wants to make their money, they should be selling a Russian-style air defense system. And they could sell 26 of them to Europe, because every European country is going to need them, and they're all going to have to be bespoke. And
interoperability will be key. And again, that's the advantage of buying an American product where one company has that level of influence. Yeah, again, Bakhmut is an interesting case because the Russians are set up to just pour fire into it. The Ukrainians feel they can't lose it. Attrition is the thing the Russians have got going for them. They need time to get ready for the Thunder Run out of Belarus to Kyiv. And every week they can bleed the Ukrainians in Bakhmut is an easier week later when they destroy Kyiv. Really doesn't matter what the losses are from a Russian perspective in Bakhmut, as long as they can sit far enough back with enough artillery and keep it a misery and keep it, as a message that really, it doesn't matter if in the end this is one single crater full of blood and steel. It's irrelevant. It does the job.
I do think you have to have we don't know what any side's casualty numbers are.
No, the numbers are all bullshit.
Looking at the sources, my educated guesstimation is the Russians have lost killed and wounded between 30 and 40,000, and that the Ukrainians have lost killed and wounded somewhere in the region of 600,000.
That's
at least a differential. If you think about it, they're putting 10 times as much munition in the air, and they're not doing very many frontal assaults.
Yep, they're just
Ukrainians
wrecking stuff. Yep.
They're standing there and shooting and drinking tea.
All right, so getting back to what David was inferring earlier, this notion of a Russian thunder run from Belarus into Kyiv, do you think that that's actually possible? At the moment, the Western media seems to be focusing on the impending Ukrainian counteroffensive to liberate Crimea and the Donbass.
Nice story.
So what kind of thunder run do you expect from Belarus, and when do you think is the most likely time for the Russians to hit?
Who do you want to go first?
My guess is, no, you go first, Daniel.
Okay. Yeah, my feeling is this is all just being delayed because no one wants to do it in mud, because of course why it failed last year is because they had to stay on the road. And it's been a much warmer winter, which means the ground didn't get hard enough. There's plenty of mud. There still is plenty of mud. But, you'd have to imagine early May onwards, all this refitted kit or pulled out of storage kit, at least 400,000 people able to go down the road, 7 or 8 columns wide, straight across fields, blowing up every fence and wall necessary on the way through. So it's a wave, doing so under good, air cover. And that's the game changer.
My view is Belarus. So you have to keep in mind there are 3 big pockets of Russian reserves. Center one that's clearly going to go all the way to Dnieper. The southern one, which I think is to take Odessa. And Odessa matters on so many complicated emotional levels to the Russians. I don't think Belarus moves unless the Poles are stupid enough to cross the border. The Poles cross the border, the Belarusian forces go in.
Yeah, but there's only
I think
60,000
they
of them. I mean, Belarus is not a European power of any consequence, right?
No,
I mean,
not the
they're effectively
Belarusians.
an internal security force.
Yeah, the Russians in
Yeah, the
Belarus.
Russian forces in Belarus. And I think that
Right.
number of 60,000, again, whatever the real number of Russians who've now been trained and moved up is, having them under a quote-unquote tactical nuclear umbrella is a great way to prepare the biggest staging ground of, well, literally the 21st century, for the biggest armoured operation of the 21st century.
But we haven't seen any evidence that there is this massive Russian buildup in Belarus. We know that there are Russian forces in Belarus, but we were witnessing this massive buildup of Russian forces on the border of Ukraine prior to the Russian special military operation. We're not seeing a similar sort of buildup with its strike force aimed at Kyiv. Is this a deliberate act on behalf of Western media being told to be quiet about this sort of thing? Or do you think, it's also a case of maybe the Russians haven't got their idea on opening up another northern front? Maybe they are really focused on the defense of Crimea and the southern Donbass area and the land bridge with Crimea.
Interesting thing about Belarus is because so much Western trucking went through there, it actually has better roads. And at some point, the Russians are going to learn, or just going to buy tank transporters. And there are more roads in Belarus you can use them on than basically anywhere else in Russia. So they don't need to be sitting 2Ks behind the border. They have more capacity, if it's a long-term logistical plan, to have stuff everywhere and bring it up more effectively in Belarus than they can from any other direction.
And the other thing is that, like, the Russians withdrew all their paratroopers. That's why they gave up, not Kharkov, what's the other one? My brain's gone blank. The one that the Ukrainians were celebrating like crazy, and my brain has just gone completely blank because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh God, it's the one that's on the river, and the Russians couldn't hold it because they couldn't supply.
Yeah, Kherson.
Kherson. So Kherson was held by Paris, by Russian Paris. And what did they do? We can't hold this because we've got to supply it across the river. We just put a whole bunch of artillery pieces on the other side of the river, and the Ukrainians can only hold it with like a handful of guys waving flags. They can't put anything serious there. And all those paras got pulled out.
And
we don't know where they're gone.
Are they the main training cohort for an awful lot of new, slightly better than average infantry to be attached to armoured columns? Quite possibly.
Yeah. My personal view is you are not going to get big push. You're going to get big squeeze. And the only reason you'd get a big push is if the Ukrainians simply cease to exist as a force.
And that's my suspicion, is that actually it's getting to that point, because even though I don't agree with your numbers on Bakhmut, Bakhmut is still an indication that what we have seen is a winter of attrition that was different than everyone planned for, but still a case that the Ukrainians went from 0 to total population involvement so quick, and it gives them an ability to do a lot more than a normal country because it is existential threat. But 42 to 43 million people, there's only a certain proportion that can do most jobs, take on most roles, and eventually it just stops working. And the question is, at what date does it stop working? And if it's been as successful in Bakhmut as it appears it might have been, simply at attrition, we're a lot closer to that day where the Ukrainians can't be in two places anymore, and can't refit anymore, and can't rearm anymore.
There's another factor which we're not really taking into account, which is the Ukrainians have massively disproportionately drawn their forces from ethnic Hungarian and ethnic Romanian forces, populations. And they're throwing them using the Russians to commit ethnic cleansing. And at some point, you're going to get a position where every guy around there is a Hungarian or a Romanian. They go, why are we dying for Ukraine?
Yeah, but it's the same thing with the Russians, that they've basically thrown anyone from a mini-Astan into the shit fight first. And this is why we've never seen the top tier Russian units, because they're all at home for population control.
Also, they're winning.
No, they're at home for population control, and they will stay at home for population control.
Okay, guys,
what I mean is the Russians are winning, so they don't need them.
So if the Russians are winning and Russia resumes the UN presidency, what are we likely to see as a consequence of that? I mean, there are a lot of people that are rather cynical about the power and the prestige of the United Nations these days, and even of the UN Security Council. So are we likely to see Russia and China start dictating terms to the rest of the UN Security Council on matters close to their heart? What do you think is the likely outcome of that? Start off with Rhoderick.
It's the UN. It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters emotionally to the Russians, probably only the Russians. My guess is the Russians will push for war crimes tribunals against the Ukrainians for their very real atrocities, and Britain and France and America will veto it. And then the Russians will take that to the Africans and say, see, we told you. That's the sum total, which they're going to do anyway. I mean, everything we do, because we do it so cack-handedly, the Russians take the Africans and the Arabs and the South Americans say, these guys are douchebags. And they're douchebags, and here's some more proof that they're douchebags, because we're run by clowns.
David?
I'll go back to my earlier comment. Everything the West will do at the UN at that level will be about the next election cycle. Everything the Russians and Chinese will do is about showing the world, look, we might be awful, but we're better than them.
Yeah.
So you either play the comms war, or you keep thinking winning at home is what matters, and winning at home doesn't matter if the world gets nastier.
Well, that's a very somber note to end this podcast on, but I think I will take that as our final point. David, thank you very much for being with us on Strategikon. And of course, Rhoderick, thank you to you for being up at this extremely early hour. So get thee to bed right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Well, that's a wrap, everyone. My thanks to our special guest, Rhoderick Miller, for being on Strategikon. My thanks also to co-host David Olney and producer Michael Migali for their contributions. And to our audience, thanks for listening. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International site, sageinternational.com.au, hitting the media drop-down button and clicking podcasts. Also, please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. All your likes and subscriptions will help the algorithm find us and bump us up the social media rankings. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel. Also, please comment on any of our podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Ozcast.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.